The title of my homily today is Do Not Be Afraid. Do not be afraid. Take heart. June Parsons and Becky Svensson asked me to speak way back in December at the youth's party. Now both June and Becky have had grandchildren who have been baby Jesus in the children's Christmas play that I wasn't part of. June, 1 year, actually not just served as baby Jesus' grandmother, but in a very kind of a twisted theological scenario that I'll let Joel parse out, served as baby Jesus' mother, Mary. And so that night, his grandmother was also his mother, Mary, and she carried him down the aisle to the manger. So when both baby Jesus' mother/grandmothers ask you to speak, you don't say no to them, even if you are a little bit afraid, not of them. And fear is a theme in our scripture today. Genesis 15, God tells Abram, whose name changes to Abraham 2 chapters later after Sarah gives birth to Ishmael. God tells Abram not to be afraid. God makes a covenant with him. God makes a promise that he will bless his family. And Abram hears the voice of God and believes. In Psalm 27, whom shall I fear? Of whom shall I be afraid? He will keep me safe in the day of trouble. Do not hide from me. I am confident in this. I will see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. In Luke, Jesus is told, run away. Herod wants to kill you. And his response, in any case, I must keep going. How I have longed to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings. And in Philippians, our citizenship is in heaven. We will be transformed and are changed our lowly bodies so they will be like his glorious one. So we have this very nice chronological timeline of our lectionary text of God and Christ speaking to our deepest fears, being involved in our lives and modeling care, love, protection, sacrifice, and ending with reunion and transformation. So hold on to that timeline of thousands of years, and we're going to step into today's timeline, February 24th, 2013. And here's another timeline for you. This is part of our Christian church year. We pause here in a moment in our Lenten journey that will end with Christ hanging on a cross. His death is already foreshadowed in Luke's words, Herod wants to kill you. And I enter this journey every year with a sigh. As I stand at the beginning of every bright new year in January, it's actually downhill for me until June. It's dark. Because of Lent, because of New England winters, and because I know what waits for me at the end of June. And what I mark at the end of June is why I always get stuck at Good Friday, at Golgotha, the place of the skulls, the place where the dying and the dead hang on their crosses and their loved ones kneel weeping below them. And I remember being afraid. And so now, to draw you a third timeline concerning my life. I know 3 timelines. Steve Cushing told me to keep this simple, but I can't. Welcome to my brain. Third timeline. A couple segments from my personal timeline. I have been a member here so long, almost 2 decades, that I forget that many of you may not know the story of my own grief, of losing my first husband when I was 23 years old. For the very good reason I rarely speak of it. It happened a long time ago, far away, and it is difficult even now for me to talk about. Some of you are perhaps aware that in 2009 I donated a kidney to an old friend. Both of those events are intricately related, and this Sunday seems to be a good time to tell you how light and darkness are blended, how promises are made and kept, how love can comfort fear, and how we can transform each other's lives. While I was at North Park College, I fell in love with a student 3 years older than I was, Carl Eric Weiberg. When I graduated from North Park in June of 1981, I was 20 years old, and we were married 2 months later. 1 week after I graduated, I was called back to Chicago. Carl was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. We lived in Chicago for 2 years as his illness rapidly progressed. He had to drop out of seminary. Some days he could barely write or walk. Some days he could not remember the letters of the alphabet. There were many hospital stays and very little money, as my job at Covenant headquarters was our only income. But that was also a bright spot for me because of the wonderful people I worked with. I shared an office with a woman who had known my mom when they went to North Park together. Yes, it's a small, small Covenant world. Her name was Sharon Fernstrom, and she married Paul Peterson. Her daughter Cindy lived in Minnesota. My mom was in Maryland. So Sharon and I filled in some of the holes for each other in Chicago. Sometimes she would go shopping, and she was part-time. And she'd say, "What do you want me to buy for you?" And I'd be like, "Oh, nothing, diamonds, chocolate, BMW." And she'd bring me back little gifts, just chocolate. Frango mints, usually. At the end of our second year of marriage, I knew I could no longer take care of Carl by myself. We made the decision to move to Minnesota to be closer to his family. It was an easy decision for him, very hard for me because I knew no one there outside of his two sisters. Happily, I had met Sharon's daughter Cindy one time when she was visiting Chicago, and when we moved to Minnesota, she and I became very good friends. The year in Minnesota was the coldest and snowiest on record. I had a long commute. Carl grew more and more incapacitated, but Cindy and her husband John were some of the bright spots in our lives. They had never known Carl, who was an avid Cubs fan, an extremely competitive tennis player, and a brilliant thinker. John worked at Colonial Acres at Covenant Village, a nursing home and a retirement center. So he was used to people who didn't remember things, who tipped over when they walked, and who wore depend diapers, just, people who were usually in their 70s and 80s and not someone who was 26 years old. They both accepted Carl as he was, since of course they had never known him before he became so ill, and because they are simply good people. Every morning, Carl's parents would come over and get him, and then I would pick him up at night and bring him back to our apartment. Eventually, he could no longer climb stairs, so he just stayed at his parents' house, but even they could not give him the increasingly complex medical care that he required. He had a rare and insidious form of multiple sclerosis. Fewer than 2% of patients have such a virulent and rapidly progressing strain, but he did. That winter, and perhaps it was Lent, now that I think about it, was dark, and our options were disappearing. We needed a handicapped accessible apartment, but the waiting lists were too long. We didn't have almost any money. I was working long days with long commutes, but it was not enough. A state worker suggested that I divorce Carl, because then there would be more money to take care of him. Needless to say, I gave that worker an uncensored piece of my mind. I decided we would just go into great debt because, hey, we're just going to die anyway, but at least I wouldn't be breaking my vow. I wouldn't be breaking the covenant I had made with him. And I didn't think my heart could handle too many more breaks because I could see what was coming. That great darkness on the horizon was fast approaching, and it was just a matter of time. Though none of us knew how much or little time there was, and it ended up much less than we hoped for. But we didn't know that then. I cried my way into work, I cried my way home, and I cried myself to sleep most of those nights. And then my dearest friend Cindy came up with a plan. She was a nurse, but she wasn't working at the moment because she was caring for their 2-year-old son. She told me, "You and Carl come live with us. We'll put a ramp in. I'm a nurse, I can take care of him during the day. Your job is 10 minutes away. We live right across the street from the Covenant home where Carl's grandmother lives and where John works, and there is a full medical facility. You come live with us for free and we'll take care of you." She had an architect draw up plans to make the entrance stairs into a ramp, and I began to tentatively hope that this might work. And then Easter week came, and Carl was admitted to the hospital again. He almost slipped into a coma. He could not return home now, as he could neither walk nor feed himself and had lost control of almost all bodily functions. Sometimes he didn't know who his family was. He was moved to that nursing home attached to the Covenant Retirement Center, where he was the youngest person by many decades. After work, I drove there every night, fed him dinner, changed him for bed, and then drove home to our apartment. A few weeks later in June, late at night, a few hours since I had just last kissed him goodnight, the nursing home called to tell me he had fallen into a coma. He was rushed to the hospital with 107-degree temperature. He never again regained consciousness. About a week later, Carl died. Just a couple hours before he would have turned 27, I became a widow at 23 years of age, and I soon fled Minnesota to return to the East Coast. That was in June of 1984. 5 years later, I married Jay, and we had Carrick and Kelsey. That same year that Jay and I were married in Rockport in 1989, Cindy was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. We had stayed in sporadic touch since Carl's death, seeing each other when we could, but neither of us loves to write nor chat on the phone. So I was surprised in January of 2009 when her sister Facebooked me and said Cindy wasn't doing well at all. I called Cindy up, and she told me that her diabetes had left her kidneys functioning at 17%. Since she was a nurse, she rejected the idea of dialysis. I asked her why she just didn't get a new kidney, and she said the waiting list was too long. And I flashed back to the waiting list for the handicapped apartments. And she'd be dead before her name came up. More than 4,000 patients die a year waiting for a kidney transplant. I asked what you needed for a kidney match, and she talked about all this stuff that I don't really like to think about or remember because it's bothersome and it makes me queasy. But I did know we had the same blood type. And I said, well, I'd have to check with Jay, but she could probably have mine. You only need one who knew I was in pretty good shape. And she would have done the same for me. She didn't want me to do this because what if something happened to me? Oh, right. Like I didn't consider the possibility that we die every single day. Oh, right. Like I don't remember holding Carl's hands as he breathed his last breath. Oh, right. Like I forgot that in October of 2008, my father died suddenly out of the blue, no warning, and I was in this church with Ruth Ann, and we were up in the futon room picking out the costumes for the children's Christmas play when Jay called me. And I dropped my phone and I fell to my knees. And Jay said the hardest thing was hearing me crying and not being able to be there to hold on to me. Spoiler alert, we die. In any case, I just love that phrase from Luke that Jesus says in response to being hunted by Herod, in response to knowing that he is not that far from his own death. In any case, I must keep going today, tomorrow, and the next day. So I told Cindy to knock it off. We're going to take this bad boy. 7 months later, I flew out to California in August of 2009, spent one night at UCLA Hospital. 6 days later, flew back across the country with Jay holding my arm, and I was back at work less than 2 weeks later. Donating a kidney is no braver or nobler or just as brave and noble as Cindy offering to let Carla and I live with her 25 years earlier. We do these things not because of glory or honor or some misguided perception that they belong on a pedestal. A dangerous place because we feel good or relieved that we cannot reach those things, but because bottom line, we love each other. And when you love each other, you care about each other the way a mother hen gathers her chicks beneath her wings. You care about each other the way that Christ cared enough to stay to do his work and to wend his way to Jerusalem and certain death in any case. Sharon, Cindy's mom, just sent me these earrings a couple weeks ago. Diamonds, they're not real diamonds. She remembered our joke from 30 years ago when we worked together. She would go shopping, she would ask me what I wanted. She also sent me the Frango mints. She did not send me the BMW. I have to remind her about that one. Cindy thinks about me every time she pees. It's quite an honor. She became a grandmother this fall for the first time. She says I have a kick-ass kidney. She doesn't spell it, but you know what I mean. And if you know me, you're not surprised that that's the kind of kidney that I have. There will always be reasons to be afraid. There will always be sorrow, darkness, and death. But our scripture also tells us about love and promises. Genesis, do not be afraid. Psalm, whom shall I fear? Of whom shall I be afraid? Luke, in any case, I must keep going today, tomorrow, and the next day. How often have I longed to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings. Philippians, therefore, you whom I love and long for, that is how you should stand firm in the Lord. Cindy reflected God's light into that dark winter when Carl was dying and my world was collapsing. I was able to reflect God's light in the midst of her illness, to let her live a little longer and a little better. And thus we uphold the covenant and the promises of love. In a moment we're going to sit in silence. I'm going to ask you to reflect upon the words of the psalm, today's psalm. I am still confident of this. I will see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. Wait for the Lord. Be strong. Take heart. And wait for the Lord. Let us sit in a moment of silence.